Hi, I'm Meta Spencer, and we're going to, I think, Washington, D.C. I didn't ask. But we're going to talk to a very exciting person who's doing activities that I think are some of the most constructive line of work that anybody can do. We are now threatened with all kinds of autocrats who would like to be our dictators, and a lot of people seem to want them, but I personally would rather see if we can fix democracy. So, my guest today is a delightful woman I've interviewed before. She's Marjan Ehsassi. She's a lawyer and an international governance expert. And she's the executive director of, I'm going to say FIDE. Is that a correct pronunciation? FIDE North America?
Perfect. Yes.
Okay. And she's a strategic director of the Democratic Action Fund and is a Berguen Fellow, something close to that, maybe. So, good afternoon, Marjan. Wonderful to see you.
Hello, Meta. It's lovely to be with you.
So, we're going to talk about democracy today. And I have reached the conclusion that although I've been a great fan of democracy all my life, put it very high on my list of values, I'm not sure that what I was celebrating was what we really should call democracy. Maybe the ancient Greeks knew better than we did about that because they ran their governments really democratically. The citizens of Athens were able to and expected to participate in actually running the day-to-day work of governing their city-state. So that certainly outdoes us. And Marjan is very engaged with organizations that are promoting citizens' assemblies, which is a current term for that kind of process. So back up a little bit. I don't know that all our listeners have heard you speak before. Tell us what it is you do and what you're in favor of.
Sure. And thank you for this opportunity. I think I agree with what you just, the sort of the problem that you laid out in the sense that democracy is still, I think, one of the best options that we have for our types of government. Um, and I think that the vision for representative democracy was actually quite a bold one and quite a courageous one, and one that I think could work. In terms of sort of having representatives represent the people to some extent in making sure that their voices are heard as society, of course, was growing. I think that over the past several decades across the world, we're seeing a dissatisfaction around representative democracies because I think that the promise of representative democracies and the reality of representative democracies are just very different. And the way that we see the problem really manifests itself in three different ways. One of them is the fact that representative democracies are really no longer accountable in the sense that people don't feel that they can hold their electeds accountable in between elections. So we're asking people to come and vote every 3 years, every 4 years, sometimes every 2 years, and that's it. And then they go home, and there's really no accountability system. It's very difficult for people to feel that they can hold those electeds accountable beyond their vote, which is part of the reason why I think a lot of people, when you talk to them about their voice, they think of their voice in terms of their vote, which, as you and I know, should not be the case. We should, as citizens of any society, be able to voice our preferences throughout, right, the terms of our electeds. So that's the accountability issue is one big part, I think, of the problem. The second part is the lack of responsiveness. In other words, people feeling like the laws and the policies that they have to live by on a day-to-day basis and obey are not necessarily aligned with their preferences. And we see this in all the data out there that people, the gulf between people's preferences and the actual policies that government is enacting are growing, and people feel more and more like they're not being heard and that government is really acting on behalf of a small group of interest groups generally and lobby groups. And so that's very pervasive as well. And we call that the problem of responsiveness. And then the third problem is the lack of inclusion of marginalized voices. So more and more, and we don't just hear this interestingly from people, we also hear this now from electeds who say, we're tired of hearing from the usual suspects. We're either hearing from people who love us and believe in what we're doing and sort of stand by us no matter what, or people who are just angry at us. And so people are more and more interested in hearing from more voices, voices that we don't typically hear from. And so the work that we do as FIDE is trying to solve and address those three problems. And I always say, it's really important when we talk about the problems of our democracy to really kind of narrow down on what are the problems that you're trying to solve before you introduce a new model or a democratic innovation as we do with citizens assemblies. The problem that we're trying to solve is very much at its core is to strengthen the connective tissue between people and government. And so that is the work that FIDE does, is how can we make sure that government and constituents have the social fabric is re-examined and that people feel that everyone is rowing in the same direction. And in doing that, we try to address the problem of accountability, the problem of lack of responsiveness, and that of inclusion. And so citizens assemblies are the model that we try and promote. Why? Because citizens assemblies are a process that allow electeds to bring together the marginalized voices, so people that they don't hear from. And in that process, they ask them to provide their input on policy reform.
How seriously do you feel that people, I mean, you say people feel they're not being heard and that the people they elect are not accountable to them, but do you agree with them? I think they're right. And I don't know whether other people do or not.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about this at FIDE. We actually have a report that we wrote last year. I mentioned the term voice insecurity in my book, in the introduction to my book. And I don't really describe it in the book. I just throw it in. And there was a lot of interest around what we meant by voice insecurity. So we published a report last summer on voice insecurity. And I think what we're trying to get at, Meta, is exactly what you're putting your finger on, which is and it's not about freedom of expression because in a country like US and I live in Washington DC, I am still able to write an article in a newspaper and I'm still able to go to a town hall. But none of this matters and none of this means anything because, when my government or my mayor or my council members ask me to respond to a survey, I have no idea what black hole that survey goes into. No one seems to really respond to me. So I think what we talk about when we talk about voice insecurity is exactly this feeling that people across developed democracies are also feeling that despite the fact that there are platforms to become involved, there aren't really that many platforms where your input is consequential or that your feedback is meaningful. And what we mean by that is that there is some kind of a feedback mechanism so that you actually know, as citizen Marjan, that when I do go to a town hall, what I say to my elected matters, that they're actually going to respond to what I have to say. And so that sense, and it's a very subjective sense of voice insecurity, I think is quite pervasive. The OECD actually just released a report last year called The Drivers of Trust, and they show for the first time really that across many different markers, demographics, that in terms of trust, lack of trust in government, what is the most able to change our trust in government is feeling that we have voice in local decision making, government decision making. So, where people feel that they have real voice, meaningful and consequential voice in government decision making, their trust goes up exponentially compared to other demographics. So, I agree with you.
So why is there a problem now? Why not before? It looks clearly that there's more, there's a lot of change, that things have gone downhill, that people are more disturbed by it than they used to be. And so why is it harder now? We have all kinds of means of communication now that didn't exist before, and it should be easier, you'd suppose. But if it's harder to get through to the powers that make decisions,
Mhm.
why now?
So, I mean, I think it's a very complicated question, and I'm not sure that I have a very sort of comprehensive answer. I think you mentioned that there are lots of platforms to provide input. I don't think the problem with our democracy is that we don't have platforms to provide input. I think the problems with our democracy is that the input that I provide is ignored. So, we often talk to different electeds who are setting up digital platforms right now because,
Mhm.
of course, everyone is kind of trying to avail themselves to different ways to create digital platforms. But unless there's a feedback mechanism so that you know that when you're getting on a digital platform and you're providing feedback, someone is actually looking at it, examining it, and then providing you with feedback, I don't think that that really solves the problem of voice insecurity. And so I disagree. I don't think that we have access. I think we have means to be involved. Like I can go to my town hall meeting, but no one cares. And we see this in data where Michael Neblo, who's a professor at the University of Ohio, has done research that suggests that, we often talk about people being empathetic. And so people are just not interested in being involved in politics. But his research shows that when you give people meaningful platforms to be involved with, they want to be engaged. And we see this all the time with citizens' assemblies. So when we bring people together in our citizens' assemblies, and people get to learn together and they sit with people that they never have an opportunity to meet and they create bonds with them. They learn together, they deliberate together, and they write proposals. And the proposals go to a government body that has made a commitment to consider those proposals and they respond to them. There is this sense of voice, there is a sense of agency, there's a sense that, I now know my place in my democracy. And those people largely, not everybody, but largely want to continue being involved because that is a very unique experience in the democracy that we're living in. I mean, my brother, I don't know if we've talked about this, but my brother is a member of parliament in Canada. He represents Willowdale, North Toronto, and he is on the streets of Willowdale every weekend when he comes back from Ottawa. I live in the United States of America, and unless I go to a fundraiser, I really don't have access to my electeds. And so I'm not sure that access, and you mentioned, there are lots of platforms. I don't know that we have the same level of
Mhm.
access in
Mhm.
terms of an average person. I read a few weeks ago that Abraham Lincoln used to have lines. People would line up outside of the White House to meet with the president.
Mhm.
Can you imagine in this day and age if any of our electeds were to dedicate, let's say, an hour a month to people being able to sign up to be on Zoom with them, just like you and I are? 10 people would win this opportunity to have a 10-minute conversation with their senator or their member of Congress. I mean, that I think could be a game changer. I don't think that people feel that level of access.
I think I'm actually more radical than you are.
Um,
Because as when I was introducing you, I mentioned ancient Greece, and I mentioned it in the context of saying it's not that they elected rulers as we do, but they actually ran the government themselves. They would be selected by a kind of a machine that did produced names out of a hat, so to speak, by chance, and they had to serve on various uh, agencies of governance. And I remember the last time we talked by phone or Zoom, I mentioned my feeling that I would like to see legislatures actually be composed not of elected officials, but of ordinary citizens chosen by lottery sortition as we select juries. And you said you didn't agree. And so I think that's, in a way, more. Maybe we're going to wind up talking about it anyway. So, so let's dive right into that. I am concerned that legislatures have are very controlled by political parties. And in the U.S., it's not just the Republican Party, but it's Trump himself. And that makes the decisions that even the party feels
Hmm.
obliged to accept. So the system itself is not working. If that
Hmm.
happens, if I'm right, if that's true, and I think almost any journalist would tell you that that's what they're seeing, then and I guess it may be true of the Democrats too. So we have a problem with political parties, and we have
Hmm.
a problem with the need of activists to conform to the group rather than to what their constituents request because they want to get elected again.
Hmm.
So what do we do about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you are again raising a very good point. You are more radical than I am, and I don't. I mean, I do believe in people being more involved. I do believe in sortition and democratic lottery. It's something we advocate for every day. But I also believe that there are people who are born to serve, and I don't think everybody wants to be a legislator or randomly selected to be a legislator. So I'm also, I think, very pragmatic at this point in my life. I want to sort of introduce solutions that might allow us to create some institutional reform. Maybe in 40 years, we will be in a place where there are bodies of government that are just run by sortition, and I would welcome that. But I think we have a long way to go to get there. And in my view, I also feel very strongly that we need things that complement our current representative democracies because we all, again, going back to rowing in one direction, I think we all need to row in the same direction, which has to be to improve the way that our societies are being governed right now. And so I want electeds to be on my team. I want to work together to introduce these institutional reforms. Um, I agree with you. I mean, I am deeply disappointed by our political parties. I'm very, of course, the Republicans are one thing, but I'm also disappointed in our Democratic Party, and I'm a Democrat. Um, I I don't I don't think that the solution is to just completely, upend everything. I do think that there are ways, and I do, we've had FIDE now. We launched FIDE about 2.5 years ago. I feel that we are in a very different place. I think that we decided after the election, last election in the United States at the federal level, that we wouldn't be working at the federal level anymore. We do most of our work at the local level, and we have incredible leaders, city managers, mayors who are really wanting to do democracy differently. And our conversations are very different meta than they were 2 years ago. There is
Oh,
a recognition that we need to do the work of engaging with the public differently. And there's an openness to wanting to do things differently that I did not feel was there 2 years ago. So I am hopeful that many people across at least the United States want change. Some of it, we often say is a skill gap, some of it is a will gap. And I would say when we first started FIDE, I felt very strongly that there was a will gap, that electeds didn't want to involve their constituents, and that there was generally this sense that, I was elected to do this work. I feel that that has changed, and we are now, I think I mentioned to you, we now have a new program called the Deliberative State Governance Program, where we're working with governors' offices and we have representatives sitting on our bipartisan cohort. And I have been extremely pleased and impressed by the level of commitment that there is to do this democracy differently.
why did you change? You say you stopped working at the federal level. That surprises me.
I mean, I just don't think that we are going to for the next, like at least the past
Mhm.
year and a half, and then for the next year or two, hopefully we'll see how things change during the elections. But um, you know, I'm not sure if there is really a commitment to hear from different voices. And as you know, the basis of the work we do with citizens' assemblies is sortition. So unless you're willing to really, draw people through sortition and democratic lottery, the process of assemblies, in my view, will not work. Now, there are people who do citizens' assemblies without sortition, but for me, I am a bit of a purist, and the sortition piece is very important because otherwise you can't claim that you have a representative sample of a city or the nation.
Good. Well, we have been, Project Save the World has been hosting now what we call public inquiries into various social threats. We did one in the fall on AI, and we've done one on global warming, and another one on preventing war. We still, as of tomorrow, we'll start a citizens' assembly about economics. And then later this year, one on governance, global governance. And each of them runs as much as we can on the basis of a citizens' assembly procedure, but much reduced in scale. We have 5-week sessions, 1 hour each week together, but with homework. People have to study up before they come and deliberate on topics that we announce for each week, some subtopic. So this works quite well, but we have no possibility of doing sortition. Therefore, I agree with you. One should use the words carefully, and I won't call this a citizens' assembly, what we do. But procedurally, we try to be open about our conversations and discussions. So, and my goal is, and my wish would be not just a local kind of deliberation with people who are here in Canada, but working toward a much bigger aspiration, and that is globally. Instead of dropping down to the level of governments in state governments, I'm expanding my horizons to try to figure out how to create a parliamentary assembly at the United Nations that would be based on true sortition, having people all over the world be invited to serve for a year or so, and do that by video conferencing. And by nowadays, there's the possibility of getting translation from any of the major languages so that everybody could hear each other, and set up deals where people in effect go out to dinner together by Zoom and get acquainted socially as well as in these meetings. So I had just this week, I had a conversation about something called the Article 109 Coalition. I don't know whether you've heard of that.
No.
Yes or no? Do you know what it is?
No, tell me.
Article 109 of the UN Charter provides an opportunity for the General Assembly to call a meeting of an amendment conference. And they could change the charter of the UN to create new houses and documents or facilities and so on. They couldn't actually implement it unless they got the P5 consent. So it's not you don't get completely exactly what you want from this, but it can be started now, and the conversations and deliberations can go on, and the amendments can be made with the view to implementing them when the time is ripe and the public is aware of them. So Doug and I had a bit of Doug's Roach, who is our most senior former ambassador for disarmament from Canada. He and I had a tiny bit of a conversation, but we'll explore it further in the future about how we would get members of such a parliamentary assembly. He would assume that, at least for the foreseeable future, the only way to elect them would be by having members of national parliaments around the world stand for election and get elected to represent their people, which I think is not very different from having nation states appoint people to the General Assembly. My preference would be to have uh, real sortition from ordinary citizens around the world. And therefore, I know that that couldn't be done now. But if a billionaire with deep pockets and a good, kind heart offered me $3 or $4 million, I think I could set up such a thing on the outside of the UN and have it carry out deliberations of the kind that go on inside the United Nations and show that the work and the decisions that come out of such a parliamentary assembly would be quite reasonable. And I think that is where we need to go to convince people of the legitimacy of such a project. That we need to show people that these ordinary people do not do crazy things if they're given the opportunity and the facilities to have extensive conversations together about the issues they're deliberating on. So, tell me, you can bring me down to size if you think I need to be reminded about reality and how we should really proceed to get to where maybe both of us would like to eventually see us wind up.
No, I mean, I think reality is what we're trying to create here. I think it's very real. I agree with you 100%. I think the level of civility that I see in citizens' assemblies between average citizens and the way that they address each other, the way they work together, the way that they're tolerant with one another's and their perspectives is actually quite grand. It's very different than what we see every day in different parliaments around the world. So I believe in the capacity of people to come together and do this work. I would just mention to you that as you're thinking about this wonderfully ambitious, and I don't mean ambitious in the sense that I don't think it's doable, because I do think it's doable, but this wonderful sort of goal of yours, to take a look at the European Commission. So you have a great example within the European Commission. We were just there about a month ago where they had a citizens assembly, they call them citizens panels, across EU countries. They bring 150 people together in person. These are not over Zoom. They bring them together to Brussels to learn together, to deliberate together, and write proposals together. And they've
Mhm.
had them on hatred in society. The one that was just happening about a month and a little bit ago was on preparedness. So writing proposals on how we need to be more prepared to deal with a crisis. And so I think it's absolutely doable. And there were 24 different languages being spoken.
Mhm.
And so, it's very interesting for me when I go with a delegation from the United States. We struggle here to do citizens' assemblies with two languages, Spanish and English. And it was quite formidable for our delegation to see the ways in which, and this from the UN, but also at the European Commission, dealing with so many different languages. And people sit in groups of 10 and they argue with each other, they deliberate with each other across these languages. So I completely agree with you. I think it is absolutely possible. So I would definitely, and I'm happy to send you more materials on the European Commission's
Mhm.
panels, because that could be a really nice proof of concept for you. The other piece that I would also just sort of mention is that the city of Brussels, the French-speaking parliament of the city of Brussels, has a citizens' assembly that at the time when I was started researching it about 5 years ago or 6 years ago, it was a pilot. And now it's become a permanent part of the Brussels Parliament. And there they do something which is very unique. They call their assemblies hybrid assemblies, because every single assembly chooses a topic. The one that I studied was on homelessness, but they've done several other topics as well. And every assembly has about 42 residents of Brussels that are drawn by sortition and 16 members of parliament. So
Hmm.
every one of their assemblies also includes the electeds. And it's a
Oh.
wonderful way of them, for them, to kind of learn how to work together. And,
Mhm.
I have research anecdotally of members of parliament saying, this is the first time that we've actually worked collaboratively across political parties together.
Mhm.
Because often when they find themselves in parliament, of course, their relationship is very adversarial. And in an assembly, we are not adversarial. The whole point of an assembly is to sit together and learn before we start deliberating on the topic. And so they learn a lot. And then the other piece of this that's very important is that then they have buy-in because they've been a part of this process. And so they, of course, want to then see those proposals become policy, right? So you have a different level of buy-in from the elected. So it's a very interesting experiment as well. And I could see you doing something with your parliamentary assembly where you have average citizens from across UN countries, member states, but that you also maybe have some parliamentarians, or maybe there's one parliamentarian from each of the countries as
Mhm.
well. I don't know. That could be an
Mhm.
interesting experiment as well.
Well, assume, and I assume along with you, that when people experience this, they always come out favorable about it. That their opinion changes in the direction of really believing that this can work, and that ordinary people exercise good common sense. I don't think in ordinary politics today, ordinary citizens do exercise very good sense. Unfortunately, I think we're very much affected by social media stories and even fabrications nowadays. You know, videos that are actually lies and so on. So I think that unless you set up a situation where people are expected to get together and promise to try to use moderation and civility and listen to each other, that doesn't happen enough. But I think I did read that in Europe or around the world, there have been hundreds of cases. I think there was a study done trying to follow the outcome of several hundred civil society events that had been staged in many places. And can you? I've never seen the numbers, but you probably know. Is it typically true that a person who's been through that kind of process, any kind of civil assembly, citizens assembly, that they tend to always believe that the 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 deliberations are more reasonable, and that the outcome is better than they may have expected at the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, I really don't think it's an assumption that I'm making. I think I'm basing it based on 6 years of research and being in the thick of things. I think that I don't know anyone actually who has gone through an assembly based on our experience. And we now have, at FIDE, we do independent evaluation. So we have a comprehensive methodology that we've put together, and we've written a theory of change, and we're creating these indicators to really try and measure the experience. Um,
Mhm.
Assembly members, there is no question that when you go through the assembly, first of all, I think the whole value, most assemblies start with a value exercise. And so they come together and they decide what values are going to drive and guide the workings of the assembly. So that's a really important moment for the 48 people who are there, or the 180 people who are there, to come together and say, these are the values that we want to hold ourselves responsible for. And
Mhm.
then the learning piece, the what makes an assembly really special is that before you argue and you start and yelling and screaming at each other, you're learning together. And so the curation of the evidence, what experts they hear from to make sure that it's objective, that it also represents a very wide range of perspectives, all of these pieces are really, really important to a good assembly. So I think in the end, not just the assembly members, but the facilitators and the electeds who come to visit the assembly, everyone goes away with a sense that when you bring people together, whether they know about the topic or they don't, I was just at an assembly in Snohomish, Washington State. It was a citizens' assembly on AI. So, to what extent should local government use AI? And many of these people didn't know much about AI. And so they learned over the course of the assembly and they wrote some really good proposals that were then submitted to the local government. So I think that very few, I mean, I don't know anyone actually who has left an assembly. I used to actually get upset because initially the electeds who come to visit and observe an assembly would say things like, wow, people are really smart. They're really committed. They take their job really seriously. And now I'm sort of like a little bit bothered because, of course, my sense is like, of course they are. You ask people to come in and they take their job very seriously. And when they leave with a certain set of skills that they may not have had when they started. I
Mhm.
mean, there is no question that they learn about the issue, of course, they learn about government, but they also learn how to listen to other people's perspective. I mean, we have data that shows that when people leave, they'll say things like, even if I don't agree with some of the positions that others held, I learned to respect them. I learned to understand, which to me speaks to a reduction in the levels of polarization after you conclude your time in an
Mhm.
assembly. So I think that all of those things really, are transformative for the assembly members, but frankly, also for people who are part of it, like implementers and facilitators, and even the researchers who are in the room.
Mhm.
And those are really powerful. And of course, there's also this sense of community when you're together and you're not on Zoom. You have meals together, you walk to and from the forum where the sessions are held together. Those really build a sense of
Mhm.
community. And we are, in fact, FIDE is launching the first alumni network. We're calling it the Impact Amplifiers Network in August. And so we've sent out surveys to assemblies that have taken place in Canada and the United States over the past 2.5, 3 years, and asked for people to provide feedback on what would they like this network to be. And so
Mhm.
we're hoping to launch, we're not hoping, we will be launching at the end of August, September. And it will be the first time that assembly members, after being involved, can continue being involved with each other, but also across North America with other assembly members.
That is a wonderful idea. Hadn't even occurred to me. Yeah. Okay. So one of the things that one of my friends, who's I often debate him with, because he tends to take opposite positions from me anyway, and he doesn't believe in a certainly not in a parliamentary assembly of the United Nations recruiting members by sortition. In
Mhm.
fact, he worries about a parliamentary assembly at the UN at all because he believes that it would be in competition with the General Assembly, and that there might be, it would do damage somehow to the overall deliberations that go on in the United Nations. Well, I think another factor that I've heard people say is that this, when people get together, they already have a plan for what topics are going to be discussed and what resources are available to them and what
Mhm.
reading assignments they should do in advance, etc., to prepare themselves. That therefore, the person or persons who plan the agenda for the Citizens Assembly has undue influence. And the success or outcome is probably already partly determined by the identification of the person who's planning the activity. What do you say to that?
They are such cynics. Well, first of all, let me just start by saying that no assembly is perfect, right? We are just learning, we are experimenting. The entire process of an assembly is meant to be iterative. But I will say, having done citizen engagement for now almost 20 years of my life, all over the world, first internationally and now for the past few years in the United States. There is no other process that is quite as deliberative as a citizens' assembly. So, to your friend who is concerned about the competition that this may cause or the conflict that this may cause with the UN General Assembly, and I have a father who used to be part of the Iranian delegation to the United Nations. I'm not sure if our General Assembly at the UN is quite as deliberative as maybe it was at some point decades and decades ago. So I don't know. I would argue that most people right now at the UN General Assembly or in many of our governmental institutions and agencies come in with a perspective that they're unwilling to let go of. So I don't think those spaces are really conducive to really good dialogue.
Mhm.
Um, I think the point that you raise about the curation of evidence is a good one. And so the way that we talk about it, Meta, when we're giving advice for the design and the implementation of assemblies, is that we want to make sure that we design our assemblies for legitimacy. And what does that mean to us? That means that you want to make sure that you stand to scrutiny. And part of that is making sure that the material that people are going to be engaging with, whether it's in terms of testimony. So we usually at an assembly, we have three different buckets of people that come to provide testimony. One of them is the academics, and their job is to come in and provide objective information, right? Data rich information, not their perspective, not yes or no, but just the facts of the case. Another bucket of people come in and they're the community advocates, and some will be for instance, climate change, some will be against homelessness, some will treat it from one angle, some will treat it from another angle, if it's housing affordability, whatever the issue is. So you want to make sure that those are very different perspectives that people hear from. And then the third bucket, which is really important, is people who come with lived experience. So you want to make sure that you have people who have experienced homelessness, who know what housing affordability can do to them and their lives in all sorts of different ways. And the other piece that's really important here, and at least FIDE does this, not every citizens assembly sets themselves up this way, but we also advise for assemblies to have a governance committee. And that governance committee is basically plays the role of an advisory council. And there also you want to make sure that you have people from the community who are well respected, but bring different perspectives so that when you're looking at the list of experts that people are going to hear from, you have a really well thought out group of people who are going to be able to say, well, you're missing this. You haven't introduced them to that. So that's one layer to protect yourself against what you're asking about. And another piece of this is people, the assembly members themselves, should be able to put their hand up and say, excuse me, we haven't heard from such and such perspective. We want to hear more from this other perspective. And so I think if you build those components into the design of your assembly, you can protect yourself from what
Mhm.
you are suggesting.
Mhm.
And again, I will acknowledge that there are probably assemblies that have happened worldwide where the choice of experts have not really given people the richness of and the full breadth of learning that they need to have.
Mhm.
But what we do is we definitely try and advise against those possibilities by introducing different measures that will kind of um, uh, work against that.
Yeah, okay. Let me go back to the first three categories that you
Yep.
mentioned. You get your academics with their data, you
Yep.
get the advocates with their passions, and then you get people with lived experience. In what is their role? I assume that you consult them to begin with, but it sounds like you're doing more. Are you bringing these people into meetings so that people can question them, or are you what is their actual activity in these events?
So they usually do a presentation. So usually they come in, they know what the remit is, which is, of course, the question that the assembly members are being asked to write policy around, and they will come in and do a presentation. Now, that's actually what you're asking is also really interesting because most often in assemblies, you will have someone present themselves live. We don't do Zoom and we don't do, some of our implementer friends and colleagues do videos, and so they have actors who will present material. I believe in live experts coming in. So we have live experts who will come in, provide testimony, and most importantly, provide an opportunity for people to ask questions. In assemblies where there's a lot of time, we also advise that you give people an opportunity to pause and reflect so they have time to really think about their questions. Because if you think about it, if someone comes in and they don't know very much about AI, let's say, it's a
Mhm.
lot to hear something from someone and not really have an opportunity to think about what you've just heard before you have to ask questions. So, much of this is driven by budgets. Budgets are tight with assemblies, and so sometimes it's hard to carve out these spaces for pause and reflects. Or, for instance, sometimes I often see that people will learn something in that first or second session, but then when they're deliberating, they want to go back to the expert and ask questions because now they're really starting to, really engage with the material. And sometimes it's possible to do that, and other times it's not. So all these things do present different
Mhm.
complications. But basically, that's the idea. We do see though, and you raise an interesting point because in the surveys that we do with participants at the beginning of the assembly and at the end of the assembly, we do ask them if they would prefer to have panels where people are actually debating each other. And often they will say they would prefer that. But that is also very, very hard. It's really hard to have presenters come where you're
Mhm.
in an assembly and you want to make sure that everybody has the same amount of time,
Mhm.
right? And so the moderation becomes very difficult.
Mhm.
And I think because it's so challenging, we still often will see in assemblies one presenter and then another presenter and then another presenter.
Actually, when I've done a whole bunch, like nearly 800 uh, panel discussions or in these video series that I produce, and I never deliberately set up a debate.
Hmm.
A real, two people chosen for their opposing views. Um, I I'm not even too careful about trying to make sure that every point of view is represented because it all comes up anyway. In the conversation, I find people, bringing up all kinds of things, but and debating things sometimes with considerable emotion.
Hmm.
But I don't. I think also my feeling is that when you set up a debate, it locks the two sides into a position. They're supposed
Hmm.
to represent this view, come hell or high water, and instead of starting off with certain differing points of view and then working together to find common ground and see if they do find that they agree more than they thought they did, which is
Hmm.
a good thing if it happens, but you can't expect that. Do you have any um, procedure for training the moderators? Um, I'll be hosting meetings for another, however long the good Lord leaves me here with the capacity to talk to people like you, because that's my favorite thing to do. But but eventually, and we're starting to find teams of people and other experts who will be the moderators for discussions that I would have normally done. And I don't know how to prepare people for that. I also don't know how to determine in advance whether somebody would be good at it because
Hmm.
not everybody can do it well, and and I can't always guess whether a particular person would be a good moderator or not. But I think if there were a training program that you knew of, I might try to draw on it for my own purposes.
So that's a really good question. And I need to take a step back because when we launched FIDE, we did capacity building schools. So we used to do large capacity building schools where everyone could sign up, and we used to do cap it at about 40 people. And we had researchers, implementers, we had some electeds and their senior staff come. And we used to do the A to Z of assemblies over the course of 2 days. So they would learn about what assemblies are, they would get to do case studies, they would learn about how to do sortition, how to write a remit, how do you land with administration. And we also used to do one session, which was a deep dive into facilitation. And it's really interesting that you asked this question because I have seen now time and time again, as assemblies are growing in interest across the US, certainly, that even though the United States, and we really do, we have a very rich history of deliberation. We know what deliberation is. We have deliberative polls, we have deliberative town halls, but the art of facilitating a citizens' assembly is quite different. Because unlike other deliberative platforms where you bring people together and they learn, they learn a little bit, they spend a little bit of time learning, maybe they even deliberate, you are ultimately asking them to leave that experience with their own perspective. And often it will change, not always, but often it will change. In an assembly, you're asking them to come together, to learn together, to deliberate, and then you want some policy recommendations to start emerging. And you want to make sure that you capture the ones that the most people are aligned with, right? And that is very hard. It's a very challenging task. And I see over and over again how people with the best of hearts, with a lot of experience in facilitation, still don't get it right. And again, we're learning. So, but what we have done at FIDE just in the past 6 months is we've developed a facilitation training tool, which is a 3-hour session that we do. And so now our whole capacity building has pivoted. We've moved away from the big schools that we used to do to what we call place-based schools. So we will go, for instance, to the city of Richmond. We were just in Cambridge 2 weeks ago, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and we did a whole day workshop for the city manager of Cambridge. And he brought 26 of his staff from all across the different departments, and we did a full day Citizens Assembly 101. Sometimes we do the 3-hour facilitation training, but we often will do that when people are actually getting ready to do an assembly so that we have the right facilitators in the room. So we do have that training. We also have some colleagues who will likely be coming to the United States in the fall, and they're like masters in facilitation training from Denmark, and they will be in the United States. So we could definitely sort of talk to you to see if you'd like to do a session or if you'd like to send a couple people to the school. We would be more than happy to do that. But it is hard. It's very complicated, and it is one of those things. I mean, you have one of the best Citizens Assembly facilitators in Toronto. Mass LBP does a brilliant job. They are probably, in my view, they are the most professional Citizens
Yes.
Assembly implementers that I know. Yes, and they do
I
a
did
brilliant.
an interview with, or a show with the leader of it. I can't think of his name right now.
Peter McLeod.
Yeah. Right.
Yes.
And I should be back in touch with him because it's certainly convenient. But if you have a pre-recorded training program or something like that, maybe I could borrow it and show it to the people that show up and say that they'd be interested in trying to become facilitators or hosts of our series. I shouldn't try to pretend that what we have is a citizens assembly, because the people that we invite ourselves, and who knows
How large are they, Meta? How many people do you typically have?
Well, the last one I did was about the Article 109, and there were just 3 people. One was Doug Roach, the most senior former ambassador diplomat for Canada about peace issues. And one was Winston Langley, a professor at University of Massachusetts, Boston, who had written a book called Abolishing War, discussing the various ways in which the various bodies of the UN could be updated and improved. And then Robin Collins, who is an activist and a brilliant scholar and a kind of a contrarian. I can usually count on him to take a different position. But and it did turn out that we all had slightly different angles. But sometimes we might, in our inquiries, this wasn't an inquiry, it was just a regular show, but the inquiries are 5 different weeks long, consecutively with only 1 hour together each week, except for the last one, which we record and edit and put on Substack. That's the one where they try to come up with the decisions about what they have already considered. And those might have 15 people. How long do these meetings go on?
So we advise no less than 4 days, 4 full days. I mean, I've done assemblies in France. The assembly that I was part of on the end of life was 27 days. So it was 9 full weekends that people came together from all over France to talk about the end of life issues. But typically we'll have 1 day of, orienting, learning, beginning to learn, a second day of learning that will then go into deliberation. And then third day, you're doing more deliberation, but you're also starting to write the proposals and the recommendations. And then day 4, you're finalizing the recommendations and you're submitting the report to the mandating body, whether it's, a local government or a statewide government or a national government. And so it's very hard to do all of that well in less than 4 days. So generally we have 6 to 7 days is probably the sweet spot for an assembly.
Mm-hmm. I did a conversation with James Fishkin 6 or 8 months ago, and he was saying that they do a before and after survey of opinions, and they also do one of the general population. So we'll see how representative the sample is that they bring together for their citizens' assembly. I think he doesn't call them citizens' assembly.
No, they're deliberative. They're deliberative polling.
And he says they typically become closer together in their opinions through the process, that they actually change their views in many cases. So they get closer together. I guess that's a good thing. I don't know.
Sessions are much shorter. In an assembly, though, we also do see very much that, there are some people who come in and they're just wedded to their opinion and they're not going to change it. But most people will change either their complete position on the issue, or most often there's just the nuances around how they think of themselves. But I think most important for us with an assembly is not to get people to think the same way and all agree on the same proposals, because to me the beauty of an assembly is, we had at the end of the French Assembly, there were about 76 people who were in favor of the law changing around euthanasia and assisted suicide, and about 24% who were against it. And one of the most beautiful comments was the 24%, the minority, that thanked the majority, the 76%, for giving them 50% of the time. So that sense of voice insecurity that we were talking about at the beginning, seeing how you can decrease that by just giving people a platform where they feel like they're being heard, even if their position doesn't represent the majority position, I think is really important. And of course, in the process, we also think, people will come at this and we'll also see changes in them, in the sense that even if I believe in something, what is in the best interest of my community? And so they'll end up voting in favor of proposals that they may not have agreed with at the beginning, but in the course of the deliberation and hearing perspectives from other people who have very different lived experiences, they then agree that those positions and those proposals might be in the best interest of their communities. And that's truly magical.
One thing that Fishkin has advocated, I guess, in the past, is a day before every federal election where they'll have a day off to do citizens' assemblies.
Well, I would ask you to definitely go to our website, also Meta, and take a look at our theory of change. because we've put together a theory of change on citizens' assemblies, and we look at it in terms of how do we define success and what is it that we're trying to accomplish? Because going back to like what is the problem that we're trying to solve? And we
Mhm.
divide the theory of change around assembly work on based on the individual changes that we see, the societal changes that we see, and then the institutional changes that we see. And you might find that interesting.
Well, we have to wind up.
Yes.
And this is always thrilling to talk to you because you have the experience
Yeah.
that I would love to have. I would love to go with you sometime and watch you.
Well, I'd love for you to come.
Okay, thank you so much. And
Sure. Please take care of yourself. It was great to talk to you.
all right.